Welcome to Chapter 5, Part 1 of The Boy Who Harnessed the Wind. Our chapter title for today is Malawi Begins to Starve. Based on that title, you can probably conclude that this is going to be a more dark, serious tone for Chapter 5. Before I start reading, make sure you have your Boy Who Harnessed the Wind journal as always. We are on slide number 17, which is Chapter 5. What I would like you to do to start before I read is pause this video and to fill in the building background knowledge square. It says, explain the rules of economics known as supply and demand. Now, this is just based on your background knowledge, so if you have no idea what supply and demand is, you may type and say, I do not know what supply or demand is. If you know what one word is but not the other, say that. If you know what both mean, that's awesome. Fill it in. So take a few minutes to enter in your background knowledge information first. And then after we finish reading Chapter 5, which will be in 3 different parts this time because Chapter 5 is very long, you will fill in a problem and solution graphic organizer. So some of the problems we're going to see in this chapter are Malawi runs out of maize. People wait in lines for a long time. And the last problem is William and others were shortchanged with the maize they bought. And if you don't know what shortchanged mean, you'll learn more about it as I read. So here we go. Let's begin Chapter 5. Part of the answer arrived in late September. Not long after taking our final exams, Gilbert and I went to the trading center to play a few games of Bawo. As we walked back to his house, I noticed something odd. About a dozen people were gathered in his yard, talking in low, worried voices. They were mostly women, each wearing brightly colored headscarves like my own mother, and carrying an empty basket. Who are these people? I asked. They've run out of food in the far villages, Gilbert said. These women have come to ask my fathers for handouts or ganyu. Some of them walked for days. Ganyu was another word for day labor, or a small job such as clearing fields or digging ridges for a little money or food. It's how many farmers in Malawi made a living when times were hard. But I'd never seen this many people at once. What's your father going to do? I said. He's going to feed them, Gilbert answered. He has no choice. He's their chief. What Gilbert said was true. The drought had destroyed all of the crops in the countryside, and the families in the smaller villages had run out of food. Their storage rooms were empty, and now they were hungry. I came home and told my father what I'd just witnessed. He'd also seen the lines of women, but didn't seem too concerned. He explained that the government always kept giant stocks of maize for emergencies. In tough times like these, they sold it on the market for a reduced price so that everyone could afford to eat. Don't worry, he said. Whatever the case may be, our family has never gone hungry. A few days later, however, my father returned from the trading center where a group of farmers had held a rally. They delivered some terrible news. A few dishonest men in the government had sold our emergency maize and taken off with the money. They're saying there's nothing left, he told my mother. This year will be a disaster. My mother's face seemed stricken. Only God can help us, she whispered. After that, hunger came to Malawi. Due to the shortage of maize, the price doubled in the market. When this happened, people started hunting for food in the forest. One evening before dinner, I was feeling a bit hungry, so I walked next door to see if I could snatch a few mangoes from Mr. Mawali's trees. When I arrived, he and his family were sitting down to steaming plates of food. Just in time, I said, but when I looked closer, I realized what the Mawalis were eating. Pumpkin leaves and stewed green mangoes. They weren't even ripe, and I'm sure they tasted awful. You'll find no food here, Mr. Mawali said, wrinkling his nose as he chewed. Later, I saw several men digging ridges in Mawali's field for ganyu. They were from the outer villages, and each walked away carrying a handful of those same green mangoes. A few days later, while walking through the trading center, I saw something else I'd never seen. Women had spread out plastic tarps and were selling gaga. Gaga are the clear-colored outer layers, or chaff, that are removed from the maize kernels in the mill. It's mostly garbage left on the mill floor and tossed away. Farmers fed it to their chickens and pigs. I like to use gaga in my bird traps, but I had never seen people eat it. Yet here, it was selling in the market for 300 kwacha a pail, 3 times what it normally cost. A group of women held metal buckets and crowded around the sellers, pushing one another to get some. "Move away, I was here first. We're all hungry, sister. There are no firsts in that." When I returned an hour later, all the gaga was gone. Right then, I felt a shock pass through me, as if someone had shaken me awake in the night. I started running home. Until then, I hadn't worried much about our own situation. Being 13 years old and always hungry explained some of that. Each meal I'd stick out my plate and ask for seconds, saying, "That's right, keep it coming." Sure, I knew about the problems throughout the country, but for some reason I always assumed they were happening to someone else. Now as I headed home, I grew more and more afraid. When I reached the house and opened the door to the storage room, I nearly fainted. Only 2 bags of grain remained. In my mind, they were already gone. I started doing the hunger math. 2 bags of maize wouldn't last 2 months. In 3 months, we'd be starving. Worse, there were still 210 days, about 7 months, until our next harvest. We haven't even planted 1 seed, and once we did plant, there was no guarantee that it would rain, or that we'd even have fertilizer. After a few days later, my father started rounding up our goats to sell in the market. In Malawi, your animals are your most prized possessions, a farmer's only token of wealth and class. Now, we were trading them for a few pails of maize. The men who ran the Kanyenya stands selling fried meat had enormous power now. The prices they offered for goats, pigs, and cows went lower each day, yet people still lined up to sell. I noticed one of the goats was Mankahala, one of my favorites. Unlike the other goats, he loved to play. He'd let me grab his horns and wrestle in the courtyard. He and Kamba had always become friends and would chase each other around the kitchen, irritating my mother. "Papa, why are you selling our goats?" I asked. He turned to me. "A week ago the price was 500. Now it's 400. I'm sorry, William, but if we wait any longer we'll get nothing." The goats were tied by the legs with rope and already crying. Kamba heard the commotion and came to investigate. When he saw Mankalahala being led down the trail with the others, he started to bark and jump. Mankalahala then turned around as if to plead for help. He knew his fate, but as much as it hurt me inside, I had to watch him go. What could I do? My family had to eat. So we're going to stop there. This is Chapter 5, Part 1. If you have any information to fill into Chapter 5, this slide, you may do it at this time. Otherwise, you can look back up here at our glossary of the Chichewa language. If there are any new words that I read in that chapter, in that part, you can fill it in here. I'll give you a hint. Bawo was just explained on page 45. So if you can fill that part out once you've done that, you are finished and you can share your Google Slides with me.